For the last couple of years, I've been leading a project called Talking with Machines, which is about smart speakers, voice-driven devices. And it's kind of a two-pronged project. The first prong is design research, so sort of fundamental user interaction questions, stuff like, if you can talk to a machine, how do you talk to it, what do the conversations look like? I'm sure those are kind of familiar questions to all of you. But they're the fundamental things that you have to start thinking about when you're starting to think about addressing voice devices. And then in tandem with all the design research, we also do a bunch of prototyping, making little interactive experiences, little software prototypes in order to figure out how to get your hands dirty with this kind of stuff. And that usually means making Alexa skills, but not always. Sometimes we're using open source hardware. Sometimes we're using Google Home. Sometimes we're just lashing stuff together out of Python in order to figure out what a little interaction flow might look like. But the idea is that the two sides sort of feed off each other. So if you come up with interesting problems on the design research side and the sort of theory, you can kick them over to prototyping to make something to test those ideas out. And likewise, if you come up with, if you run up into a particularly knotty problem on the prototyping side, then you can kick that over to the design research side to think about it in a bit more depth. So the two sides sort of feed each other, and that's what we've been doing. That's how we've been working for the last couple of years. We've done a whole bunch of projects, some internal, some external. But the one that is probably the most visible and has had the most press is the inspection chamber. Let's have a show of hands. Who in the room has heard of the inspection chamber? Okay, it's a few. And have all of you who've heard of it tried it? Have you run through it? Okay, that's a lower number than I expected, that's fine. So the inspection chamber is a 20-minute interactive science fiction story for Alexa. And in it there are 4 characters. There are these 2 alien scientists who are kind of bickering between each other. There is a glitchy computer called Dave, and there is this 4th character, this kind of mysterious alien being. And the scientists have been tasked with figuring out what this mysterious alien being is and what it does and how it ticks. Because only when they figure it out can they go home. And you realise fairly early on in the piece that you are the mysterious alien being that they've discovered. And they're asking, the only way that they have of finding anything out about you is by asking you questions through your device. So the whole piece sort of takes place as it's almost like these 2 scientists sort of interrogating you and trying to figure out what makes humanity tick. I've got a little video clip of the first sort of interrogation so you get a feel for what it's like. Hopefully I won't deafen you all.
The first thing would be for you to say who you are. What do you call yourself? Perhaps Dave knows your type already and we can save time.
And we can go home.
What do you call yourself, being?
Nikki.
Dave, did that help?
Specimen not identified.
Oh, let me have a go, Kate. Please, just let me. What if we offer it some basic choices? Things that make sure it will definitely fit into the database, so we can wrap this up and all go home.
You mustn't influence a specimen. We can't cheat. Buy the book.
Yeah, book schmuck. Being, which of these do you identify with? Humanoid.
You can rule that out.
Humanoid, hujamaflip, hummingbird, hummus, carrot.
This is scientific. That's a nonsense list.
Sometimes nonsense works. Think of it as the opposite of a logic test.
An illogic test.
Yeah. Tell us, Being. Humanoid, hujamaflip, hummingbird, hummus, or carrot?
Carrot.
See? It's a vegetable. Not an animal at all.
So vegetable talk now.
Being does not fit into any identifiable field within the database. Database incomplete.
We need to run more tests.
So you get the idea. There's this kind of continued sort of comic interaction between you and scientists, and to start off with, they're kind of asking you these fairly simple questions to figure out if you can even hear them. And by the end of it, when near the end of the 20 minutes, they're like, is humankind fundamentally cruel or fundamentally kind? And the answers that you give kind of sort of deflect the plot slightly. It's not really choose your own adventure, but it is things like answers that you give to questions come back as punchlines later, or they affect the way that scientists talk to you. They might talk to you more aggressively or more calmly, depending on the answer that you give. So it's not really this massive branching thing, because we don't really think that's particularly satisfying if you just want a piece of entertainment. But your answers do sort of affect the texture and flow of the story. So we released this in November last year. It got quite a lot of nice press, which is nice. I mean, I don't think I necessarily agree with that headline, but it's a nice one to put up during presentations. And yeah, it paved the way for a lot more interactive voice production in the BBC. There's a whole load more activity happening now around the corporation. There's a whole big business as usual team that's doing all the sensible stuff while we continue to do our experiments. But there's a few interesting things that came out of the inspection chamber as a project. We were testing a lot of stuff when we released it. I mean, the idea of like a long-form entertainment conversation isn't something that's particularly native to Alexa or Home or anything, where most conversations are sort of optimized for fairly short transactions. So the idea of trying to make a sort of long-running piece of entertainment was a bit alien, still is quite alien. And so in order to do that, we had to build our own tools. This is a snapshot from a tool that we built internally called Orator, which is a design tool for building these kind of long-running entertainment conversation. It does look very similar to a lot of conversation tools design tools you would have seen. It's got nodes, it's got lines between them, it's got nodes that represent things the device is saying, nodes that represent things that you're saying. But at the time we started making the inspection chamber, support in the sort of third-party tools for audio was very bad. Like, you might be able to get the odd SSML tag in there to play some audio, but it wasn't really particularly well supported because most things biased towards using the system voice, the robot voice. So we had to do a lot of work to support audio properly, to figure out, to sort of collapse the... There's a lot of detail that I could go into later that isn't particularly interesting now. But the point is, we had to build our own tooling in order to make the inspection chamber, specifically for doing these kind of rich audio stories, which is kind of currently working its way through the BBC, and some bits of that might see open source one day if we're lucky. And the other thing is that off the back of the inspection chamber, we did a really large user study. Well, I say large. So we got a lot of raw analytics on how people used it. Unsurprisingly, it kind of shows a lot of use in the first few questions, and then it kind of dropping off towards the end of the 20 minutes, which is fine. We kind of expected that. But also, there's quite a few repeat visits, which is interesting. People tend to come back to it a few times to see how much difference their answers make. And we also commissioned a really big user study off the back of it. So once it had been out in the wild for a while, we did really in-depth interviews with 24 people who had used it, and they were from all different backgrounds. Some of them were like hardcore radio listeners who weren't really into interactivity. Some of them were gamers who wanted them to be really, really interactive. And we interviewed all of them about their experience with the piece, and in a lot of detail about whether they like the plot and the characters and the pacing and what sort of questions they were being asked. And we have just released the analysis of that at this short URL there. So if you're interested in how users respond to this kind of long-form entertainment conversation, get a load of that. You can go through that document in far more detail than I could go into here, but it's really, really good if you're kind of interested in this kind of fictional stuff. So I mentioned that the inspection chamber is part of a much larger, longer-running project called Talking with Machines. This is one of the first things that we did in Talking with Machines, and it's a prototyping methodology for developing a voice experience, all the way from I might want to make a voice device with some of my brands or properties or characters in, through having a few steps of a written script, which and role-playing that out, which incidentally is like every time we prototype something, this sort of loop in the middle of writing a short script of what it is that you're trying to do, role-playing out with the members of your team, and just prototyping it really rapidly that way, always turns out to be the most useful bit of the design process. So, I mean, again, this is probably not that unfamiliar to a lot of you, but if I would leave you with one sort of thought from our work, it's like this loop here is the core of developing a voice experience. And it's also much cheaper than doing this bit, right? It's because if you're just doing this by writing something in a room and trying it out, you're not even writing any code yet. So the idea is by the time you get to writing code, you've actually already prototyped a lot in that loop. There's a lot more of this sort of stuff on the R&D blog. As I say, this is sort of like condensing a bit of work. Yeah, I'll put the address of the blog at the end. This is just to illustrate, you might have seen this slide a few times. This tends to get used in, like, Amazon tends to use this quite a lot, because to make the point that the core of the design experience is not sitting down and writing code, it's putting your team together, and hopefully that team will include, in here we've got, this guy's a software developer, this is a content editor from Children's, this guy's a UX designer, and this lady is a user experience designer. So all of these people working together have written this script, and then they were then testing it in here. Again, to make the point that it's the people that make this stuff, not the software, and it's the interdisciplinary teams that make this stuff. It's like if you've got these teams with all of these different voices on it at once, you're going to make a much better product than if it's just a single developer trying to figure out how language works. As I mentioned, a lot of this work is up on the blog. I'll put the notes for that. But I wanted to kind of close by talking about some of the work that we're going to be doing next. Because the inspection chamber was, at the end of last year. So since then, this year, we've been doing a little bit more sort of experimental work, trying to feel out the possibility of smart speakers as kind of experimental sound devices. Because when you look at something like Alexa, that represents it's a product, it's a mass market product now, right? It's in millions of people's homes, it's a smart streaming speaker. And that's a category of product that's kind of unlike anything else that's come before. So there have been things like Sonos, streaming boxes, that kind of thing, but they've always been a bit niche. So to have this kind of smart speaker, a streaming audio device in people's homes that's backed by a bit of compute power so you could do smart stuff with it, that's kind of a new category of product. It's a bit like a radio, but it's cleverer, from the point of view of the BBC. So we've been exploring this a little bit and seeing what that means as a kind of a platform for doing experimental sound art, for creativity, that kind of thing. This is a snapshot of an installation we made in a conference room. This was our orchestra of 8 Alexas. Each of these are playing a different part of a music piece. I have some video of that, if anyone would like to see that. I apologise for the shaky cam in advance, but it's quite fun. That sound doesn't sound good.
Alexa, start in B flat.
Section 13.
Alexa, open and B flat.
Section 3.
Quite pleasant and ambient. Obviously, this is not a prototype of a user-facing product. Mostly, not least because not many people have 8 of these units in their house. But the idea of just trying to use them for something a little bit more creatively interesting than having a conversation about ordering toilet roll or something. And off the back of this, let's talk over this. Maybe there's back in. So off the back of this, we've started to do this is accidentally sort of taken off. We recently did, after doing this, we took a version of this to the music hack space in Somerset House, and we did a hack day where we teamed up 4 electronic musicians with 4 technologists from R&D, and just tasked them with making some sort of creative tool by the end of the day. So it could either be a tool for performance, or it could be a creative tool for people to use at home to make music. And we just wanted to sort of push those boundaries of what is possible with these devices. Obviously, you can imagine that it was more ramshackle than it was successful. But I think that by trying to push what you can do with these devices, you sort of end up figuring out a lot more about them than if you just try to go down the straight and narrow path. Sort of by pushing for like fairly experimental musicians to try and make something interesting, I actually learned a lot about things like latency and sound quality, and if they're stable enough to be used in a performance environment, that kind of thing. I have some video from that, but it would probably put us over time, so I won't bother with that. But I just wanted to sort of close out on all of this stuff. Obviously, there's links to all this stuff on the blog, so if you're more interested, you can dive into it. I can tell you about it later. So that's singing with machine stuff. We recently took it to Sonar, the music festival, which is quite a big deal because that was, it's one of the biggest music festivals in Europe, and it's kind of a sort of all about creativity and technology stuff. We were invited to go and present a version of the musicians' workshop and do a load of stuff about creativity and R&D. Up there is my colleague Tim with the nicest compliment our team has ever received, which that was a nice thing to have in an email. So that's one strand of stuff, and then our next release is going to be an adaptation of a radio play, which was broadcast in 2010, based on a book that was published in 1969, so the book shipped like this in a box, in a bunch of different sections. The idea is every time you read the book, you'd shuffle it into a new order and read it in this kind of randomised order. The book itself is called The Unfortunates by an author called B.S. Johnson. And it's kind of about grief and loss and memory and how your mind plays tricks on you when you go to a place that you used to know. So obviously it's all about the sorts of thoughts you have when your brain's in a random sort of order anyway. So to have a randomised book kind of reflects the content in a really nice way. The radio play went out in 2010. The producers of that radio play made it in 17 separate sections and didn't know the order they were going to broadcast those sections in until they picked it live on air. But obviously then they played it out on linear radio, so it got frozen in one particular order. So we've gone back into the archives, re-randomised it, and we're going to release that as a skill fairly soon. Interestingly, that's going to be an almost completely passive experience. Some of the user feedback from the inspection chamber was, so sort of hardcore radio listeners like the fact that it was doing something dynamic, but they didn't particularly want to interact with something. I mean, radio, in some ways, is a really passive medium. So this next thing is basically an experiment in something that is dynamic but not interactive, but it does something interactive. It uses the platform, it uses compute. You don't necessarily have to interact with it. Our next release after that is going to be a lot more interactive. So we're sort of plumbing this line between being super interactive at one end, being super passive at the other, and making things along that spectrum and trying to figure out what it is that people like along that line. So I think I'll leave it there. If you're interested in our work, you can find lots more on the blog. You can follow me on Twitter. I am at Prehensile. I don't put that up because I'm currently having a bit of a Twitter detox. But occasionally stuff will pop up there, and you go from my history, there's a bunch of stuff. Or you can find me in the pub later. I'll leave it there.
Questions?
I've got time for questions.
Any questions? Someone?
Tom!
I'm really interested in how you got the audio quality so good on Alexa for the inspection chamber.
The answer to that is twofold. One is that we worked with a production company who had experience in doing games, and obviously, a lot of, not so much anymore, but a few years ago, if you're going to be doing gaming stuff, they were quite limited platforms. So a lot of that sort of knowledge about how to deal with like limited codecs, limited bitrate, all of that sort of stuff comes back again. So that's one. We work with a company we're used to mastering for low bitrate. The second is that we did a lot of testing. So we did the guy who did the production on this was a trainee who had come up through this R&D placement program, and one of the places that he was placed on before coming to us was like a sound engineering team, and we sit near a sound engineering team, and there's a lot of research there in like psychoacoustics and that kind of stuff. So we were able to sort of effectively, the short answer is FFmpeg with a lot of like custom tweaking, but that custom tweaking comes from the kind of institutional memory of R&D. Is that,
I'll get you to give me that company's number later.
for sure.
Anybody else? Questions?
The conversational piece you put together for the chamber
Yeah.
was about 20 minutes. From your research, did it come back with what is the ideal length which works before someone switches off for whatever reason?
So, I've got a graph in another presentation which I really want to show you, but I'm not sure if I'm allowed to show it outside the BBC. But imagine time from like 0 to 20, and imagine a curve that drops off as you might imagine it does. So you've got very high engagement over the first 3 questions at the beginning, and then it kind of drops off fairly rapidly. But the interesting thing is that it doesn't continue to drop off. So it drops off quite a lot over the first few questions, but then if you've got someone by like the 4th question, they generally tend to stay for the whole thing, so it's quite flat at the end of the curve. So I guess what I'm saying is, a lot of people drop off quite early, but the ones who stay for the whole thing, like once you've got their interest. I don't personally think expecting somebody to sit with an echo for 20 minutes, especially when it's an interactive thing, is a great model. I mean, we did it because it's the BBC, and the BBC is used to making things in 20-minute chunks, so it's kind of the easiest thing for us to make. Having said that, some of the research shows that people did like that. People are using Alexa and things like it to listen to long-form content. Like loads of the BBC's listening is podcasts and live streaming, and that is passive listening sessions that go on for hours, right? All of this is waffle, but what I'm saying is there isn't an optimum yet. We don't know if there's an optimum. We know that there is a behaviour of passive listening that goes on for a long time. Obviously, most active interactions with Alexa are very short because they're quite transactional. The next thing we make is going to be much shorter. So the next big production we make is probably going to be episodic, like micro-episodic, on the order of days, and maybe you're getting a few minutes every day, and that's kind of spread out over a week or something. That's probably the form that our next thing is going to take. So it's kind of it's long form in the sense that you're engaged with it over a few days, but each day you only engage with it for a minute or so. And I think that's probably a more natural fit for something like Alexa, where people are interacting with it daily but for short bursts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. There's a part to that question as well, based on what you said.
Yeah.
If it was in the first couple, 4 or 5 questions where they are in state and go,
Yeah.
so to speak, what were the little tricks which you found through that experience which kept them there?
That's a good question. So the model we took was kind of like, so it's like I was saying, it's less choose your own adventure, and it's more like immersive theatre. So if you've been to something like Punch Drunk, or any of those shows where you're like the audience members are part of the show. I mean, the hook there, basically once if you've got somebody who is interested in seeing how their actions affect the piece, or if you've got someone who buys into the idea of playing a part in that piece, then they generally stay on board. So that initial drop-off is basically people not buying into the conceit. If they do buy into the conceit, then you've got them. So to go a little bit into detail, things like the types of questions that we ask people seem to make a difference. So some of the questions that we ask during the piece are fairly open. So we go, what have you been doing today? And we don't bother responding to that, it's just a completely open question, and the scientist question goes, yeah, nice, anyway, as I was saying. So it's a sort of, it's a way of making you feel like you've contributed something that isn't actually listened to, and that's an old like immersive theatre trick, just like asking open-ended questions and then not really listening to the answer, just giving the impression that you've listened. People didn't like that at all. Obviously, a lot more of the questions, things like that. The video I showed you where it's multiple choice, which is much more like the kind of Alexa patterns you're used to. People like that. I think the one thing that people really wanted to see that we didn't implement, that we hopefully will, is like we ask at the beginning, we ask, what do you call yourself? Expected people to say human, but a lot of people gave their name. And then they were really disappointed that we didn't use their name through the piece. Now obviously we couldn't have done that because we were using pre-recorded audio, so unless we pre-recorded like hundreds of names, we couldn't respond to that. But that kind of really personal level personalization, I think would be a powerful hook. And the data that the study that I linked to earlier has a lot of stuff in there about, even if you're just doing stuff like using the user's local weather or like street names near where they are, or that kind of stuff. Like, it's cheap tricks, but it makes you feel a lot more connected to the stuff. So working in data that you know about the user, I think, would be a very powerful way to keep them stuck to the piece.
Thank you. Yeah, one last one.
When you did that design piece or that iteration with those 24 in-depth user studies, what were you trying to optimize for? What were the overarching design questions that you were trying to answer?
So we weren't trying to optimize for anything. This was a kind of post hoc thing. It was more a sort of user study, the output of which informs our next thing. The questions themselves were pretty wide-ranging. So there were sort of, fundamentally, there were 4 areas that we were asking questions about. One of them was what people thought about the piece itself, the plot, the fiction, the drama, which is, I guess, really just asking them to play literary critic. The second thing we were asking was about the interactions themselves, so whether they liked the open-ended questions, whether they liked multiple choice questions, whether they felt like the sort of the things the machine was asking them and the things they were saying back to the machine was an interaction that they enjoyed. We did a bit of research around listening behaviours, so whether people's, because this is much more lean forward than radio, we wanted to know how much it caused people to change, like for instance, change their routine or change what they're doing, sit down and really listen to it if that was the thing that they enjoyed doing, so about user behaviour around the piece. And the fourth thing was a sort of open-ended, given that you've listened to this now, what would you like to see next? So it's more sort of market research and gauging the temperature on a few different fronts, which is a bit of research that will inform our next thing and the BBC's next thing and hopefully your next thing now we've released it. But it was less about specifics to make like a really tight iteration, and it's more to get a sort of get a broad range of feeling about a number of aspects of it, because the whole of voice and the whole of making productions for voice is so new, right? Like, it's basically a completely unknown landscape. So I think vague stuff that points to things rather than very tight. You know what I mean? Like, we're still mapping the broad spectrum of the area rather than trying to like map specific paths through it. If that makes sense. We're trying to work out the landscape rather than particular paths by doing that research.
Feeling around in the dark for the light switch, see what sticks.
Yeah, at least trying to work out where the light switches are.
Yeah, got it. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, thank you very much, Henry.